Okay, well, let's begin. I suspect quite a few people are going to join us along the way, but we'll begin with the people who are here right now. Welcome to all of you. This is our Thursday afternoon speaker series in cultural psychiatry. These are talks that occur within the framework of the Division of Social and Transcultural Psychiatry at McGill. I'm Lawrence Kermer, I'm a psychiatrist here, and I direct this program. And within that rubric, we have a series of different thematic speaker series, one of which is Culture, Mind, and Brain, which is where you are today. And within Culture, Mind, and Brain, we have a speaker series devoted to the book, Culture, Mind, and Brain, which was recently published by Cambridge. So we're very fortunate to be able to have many of the contributors to this book do presentations on their own chapters, and in particular to not only reflect on some of the topics in their chapter, but maybe to carry it a little bit forward and to give their latest reflections on the kind of material that they've incorporated in that book. I'm glad to see some of the other contributors here today, Maria Zajonc and George Northoff. But in particular, I'm delighted today to be welcoming Professor Shinobu Kitayama, who's the Robert Zajonc Professor of Psychology at the University of Michigan. He's also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. He's one of the co-editors of the book, in addition to his own specific contributions to the book in his own chapter. His imprint and impress and vision is present throughout the book and many of the contributions and frameworks at play. So we're very, very glad to be able to hear from Shinobu today. Just a word about process here. So we have about 2 hours for this. Shinobu will talk for 50 minutes to an hour, and then we'll have time for discussion. If you have comments or questions, if you want to write things in chat, they can be looked at later, but then there'll be a chance for all of you to speak up and share your reflections and comments at the end. I hope we can have a long and rich and spirited conversation as we've had in previous talks. I should also say this talk is being recorded so that we can make it available to other people who can't attend today and as a kind of supplement to the book. The comments and discussion probably will not be included, so you don't need to worry about that. If we decide that there's something really important we need to include, it may just be the response from the reader. If we do want to include any of you, we will contact you and make sure that that's okay with you and so on. So again, no worries, just feel free to speak your mind without too much self-editing, and because I hope we can have, as I say, a really stimulating discussion. So without, I should say, I guess my final word of introduction and thanking Shinobu again for being with us. He's been able to contribute to our summer school program in the past around some of the same material, and we're just so honored and delighted to have you here today and to hear more of your inspiring and seminal and stimulating work. So happy to turn it over to you, Shinobu.
All right, so thank you so much. Let me share my screen. How can I do this? Oh yeah, share screen. Do you see my?
We see half of, now we see your slide, yeah.
Oh, okay, very good. So it's wonderful to speak to all of you. My name is Shinobu Kitayama. Thank you so much, Lawrence, for a wonderful introduction. It's great to be part of this group. Today, I want to discuss some highlights from the chapter we did for that book. Lawrence, Carol, Connie, Rob, and I edited a wonderful book. Our chapter is on the mutual constitution of culture and the self, or mind. I did this chapter with a student of mine, Jin-Kyung Yu. Our chapter addressed one of the core issues in social and behavioral sciences, namely the relationship between culture and agency, or the relationship between society and the self. This whole issue has been hotly debated in sociology, anthropology, and more recent years in psychology too. to give you some sense of the issue, I want to start with this French anthropologist slash philosopher, Pierre Bourdieu. He observed that agency, or the habitus in his terminology, amounts to systems of durable, transposable dispositions that function as structures which generate and organize practices and representations of culture. The same idea is echoed in the writings of British sociologist Anthony Giddens. He talked about structuration of the mind and society. Here, Rick Schrader, anthropologist in Chicago, who argued that culture and the psyche make each other up. In the same spirit, Hazel, Marcus, and I have insisted that culture and the self are mutually constituted. And this photo, of course, is from a very good old days. So general idea is that on the one side, there's agency. Bourdieu's durable dispositions or psychological systems of producing actions. This agency is shaped through participation in culture. At the same time, once shaped, it is instrumental in shaping the very culture from which it has been derived. This view of mutual constitution has guided our work. In psychology, one important impetus to study the relationship between culture and the self happened in 1990s when many social, developmental, cognitive psychologists began using their trade of running controlled experiments to examine cross-cultural variation in psychological processes. Focusing largely on a comparison between European Americans and East Asians, we propose that European American cultures are organized by a model of the self as independent, whereas East Asian cultures are organized by an interdependent model of the self. Subsequently, starting around the time of the 21st century, many scholars began investigating regional variations and other interdependent cultures. We have investigated theoretically critical within cultural variations, including the uniquely individualistic and independent ethos one can find in Hokkaido, a northern island of Japan that has a unique immigration history over the last 150 years. We have also explored rice versus wheat regions of China and found that rice farming is linked closely to interdependence. More recently, we have extended this work to other cultures. For example, Arab cultures are interdependent, but they are different from East Asian cultures in that Arab cultures are much more self-assertive as opposed to self-effacing. We have also recently explored Latin American version of interdependence, which is mediated by emotional expression. Over the last 10 years or so, we have began exploring another frontier in the study of culture, namely neuroscience. Early on, we tried to replicate the prior behavioral findings with brain indicators. Gradually, however, we began looking into the mechanisms of how culture may get ingrained. In this talk, I want to highlight this most recent work, but before we get there, I want to point out a few generalizations that can be made on the psychological differences between European Americans and East Asians. There are tons of data showing some generalizations and numerous various nuances of East-West contrast. So it is dangerous to gloss over all the nuances and details. However, it is not unreasonable to make three general points. First, self is different. European Americans may have independent self, being oriented toward personal goals and desires, In contrast, East Asians may be more interdependent, giving greater priority to social concerns and norms over personal goals. One simple but powerful way to test this possibility is to ask subjects to describe themselves freely in 20 different ways. This task is called 20 statement test. When you administer this task, you typically find that European Americans produce a number of abstract traits of the self. They may say, for example, I'm smart, friendly, and outgoing. But Asians typically do not do that. They are more likely to describe themselves in much more context-dependent, situationally contingent, and therefore relatively concrete terms. Saying, for example, I often play tennis on Saturdays. Even when they refer to a trait, they qualify the description by saying, for example, I'm smart in school, but often I'm so dumb at home. A typical finding is reported here by Ree and colleagues. In this study, the self-description task was administered to both European Americans and Korean students at NYU, and here's the result. Here it is. So as you can see, the proportion of abstract traits is significantly higher for European Americans than for Koreans. And situation-specific, context-dependent descriptions are greater in frequency proportion for Koreans. In addition to this, in this study, Ree and colleagues tested many Asian Americans. Interestingly, some of them did not refer to their Asian ethnic heritage in their self-description. So they are designated here Asian A, Americans, unidentified. However, some other Asian Americans did refer to their Asian heritage one time or twice. So those people are designated as Asian A, Americans, one ID or two IDs. And here, their results, as you can see, the Asian Americans who are not identified with a heritage Asian culture were no different from European Americans. But the more identified they are to their Asian heritage, they are no different from Koreans. Now, second, in social perception, there's very interesting cultural difference in perspective taking. European Americans tend to take inside-out perspectives, looking at others from their perspectives. In contrast, East Asians tend to take outside-in perspectives, looking at things, including the self, from others' perspective. In this study conducted by Wu and Kaysar, pairs of subjects play a game of having other person move the objects as quickly as possible. They saw grids like these. Their partner is seated on the other side. As you can see, some of the grids are occluded from the view of their partner. Now imagine that you are seated on this side and hear your partner say, why don't you move the block one slot above? Your task is to follow your partner's direction as quickly as possible. In this case, however, there are two blocks, as you can see, E, was printed on it, and there are two blocks. Which one would you move? Well, you have to take into account the view from your partner's perspective, and your partner is seeing only one block, and therefore you must move that block. The interesting finding is that here, well, study was done at the University of Chicago, Asian Americans, Chinese in Chicago, and European Americans in Chicago were tested, and they had no problem in performing this task. However, when researchers measured a fixation of gazes, Americans made a significantly more gazes when there's a competitor objects, as in the screen. Chinese had no such problem. Not surprisingly, it took longer. It took Americans longer to perform the task when there's a computer object, but there's no such delay for Chinese. So perspective taking occurs in both groups, no problem, but it seems effortless for Chinese, but it seems quite effortful for Americans. Third, in cognition, European Americans, oh, by the way, I am saying Americans all the time, and I should say European North Americans, because some studies are done actually in Canada as well, but not in Mexico. It's a European heritage, I mean, Western European heritage, American culture, North American culture. Let me refer to Americans in shorthand. So in any event, we now know that European Americans focus on objects while being oblivious to objects' context. In contrast, East Asians tend to be more holistic, meaning that they are more attuned to context. And we argued that independent individuals engaged in independent culture have personal goals, and they can, or they are willing to focus their attention on goal relevant objects, but interdependent individuals are more attuned to social surrounding, and that's reflected in the range of attention. Now, here's a task we invented to address this type of cognitive difference across cultures. Here, subjects are shown as square, and one line is embedded in that square. There are two tasks. In absolute task, you have to ignore, the subjects have to ignore the surrounding square and draw a line that's identical to the first line, which is identical in absolute length. In the second task, relative task, well, essentially you have to do kind of same thing, except you have to draw a relative length. Well, we carried out this task for the first time quite a few years ago. More recently, we tested 4 groups. In this study, as you can see, error is much greater in the absolute task than in the relative task for Japanese, but this difference was nearly disappeared for European Americans. We also tested 2 groups, 2 Western European groups, and they are falling right in between. Northern Americans, European heritage Americans appears to be quite extreme. In some other studies, we did find that this difference get reversed. So, well, that's where things seem to stand. Now, so here's a summary of it. It seems fair to say that there are 3 robust cultural variations in psychological tendencies. First, Americans are more independent, whereas Asians are more interdependent. Second, perspective taking is more spontaneous for Asians than for Americans. Third, Asians are more holistic in attention and cognition than Americans. It is important to keep in mind, however, that these are generalizations. All generalizations have exceptions, oftentimes lots of exceptions. And in fact, our work has begun to show that people are systematically different in terms of their readiness or sensitivity to cultural influences. Some people are more attuned to culture's norms, rules, patterns than some other people. That is, the cultural differences summarized here may be more systematic for some people than for some others. How can that be? I want to propose that culture needs 2 types of people to sustain itself. First, every culture needs people who acquire and internalize the canonical mentality of the culture. They carry cultural traditions. They believe hegemonic ideologies of their culture. Moreover, they show behaviors that are most appreciated or valued. Their mentality faithfully mirrors their cultural values and conventions. Hence here, they may be called the faithful believers. They are excellent, of course, when the culture is doing very well. Second, however, all cultures also need to change when difficulties and challenges arise. Hence, every culture also needs what I call opportunistic conformist. That is, every culture needs people who don't internalize culture's canonical mentality. They show quite a bit of variations in behavior. Since they don't believe the hegemonic values or ideologies of culture, they do not engage in the most sanctioned ways of life. They thus do not carry the culture's traditions. They merely conform to the majority in a quite opportunistic fashion under ordinary circumstances. However, they do provide much needed variations in behavior when culture needs to change due to various adversities and challenges. What factors might differentiate between the two personality phenotypes, faithful believers and opportunistic conformists? There are many factors, obviously. For example, if you are brought up in a segregated city in which Black men could be killed by the white police, there may be a good chance that you may become committed to the value of equality and diversity. In the context of the historical evolution of culture over the last 50,000 years, however, I think it's important to consider certain genetic, epigenetic factors. The distinction between faithful believers and opportunistic conformists relates to mode of cultural learning. To address our question, it is therefore important to see how cultural learning might take place. Here's a conceptual model we proposed recently. As you can see, the brain engages with the culture. As you can see, brain engages culture whenever it starts functioning. From the very beginning of life, throughout life, and without any break whatsoever, at least when people are awake. The brain acts in some way, and the behavior goes well, and in that case, brain receives positive feedback. Such feedback will not happen if the behavior is inappropriate. Positive reinforcement will strengthen the connections of the neurons that are recruited to perform the behavior. When this reinforcement accumulates over time, there will emerge systematic structural variations in the brain. We now know that such plastic changes of the brain happen as a result of many years of experience in driving a cab in a complex European city like London, training in juggling, and a number of years of practice in a musical instrument like piano. Now the question is whether analogous changes may occur as a result of living in different social ecologies and institutions, which are often organized by different models, including the models of the self as independent and interdependent. With this consideration in mind, we have investigated the possibility that the dopamine D4 receptor gene called DRD4 might play an important role. This gene regulates the dopamine activity in the prefrontal cortex. The dopamine is a neurotransmitter involved in reinforcement learning. Indeed, this gene appears to modulate responsiveness to reinforcement contingencies existing in the environment. So there's a good reason to expect that it might modulate the responsiveness to cultural reinforcement contingencies. How does this work? Of interest is one polymorphic region of this gene, so-called the 7 or 2 repeat variant of DRD4, appears to predispose these alleles carriers to be more responsive to reinforcement contingencies. This responsiveness may increase the likelihood of the carriers to acquire the normatively most sanctioned patterns of behavior. That is, there are good chances that carriers may become the faithful believers of their culture. Without this increased responsiveness to culture's reinforcement contingencies, they may remain opportunistic conformists. It is important to note that 7 or 2 repeat variants of DRD4 emerged over the last 50,000 years on Eurasian continent. We suspect that the evolutionary pressure to form an increasingly larger and more effectively organized non-kin-based cultural group during this period may have precipitated this genetic change. In a recent study, we tested 72 subjects, both European Americans, I mean, this is Americans at the University of Michigan, and also Asian-born Asians spending their time in Ann Arbor. We examined whether DRD4 might be involved in regulating the processing of reward signals. We used a standard gambling test and assessed 2 event-related potential components. One is reward positivity, which is an index of bottom-up reward processing. Another one is P3A, which is an index of top-down attention. This higher order attention is required to integrate the bottom-up reward signals over many trials. So bottom-up reward processing helps you find a reward queue on separate occasions, and top-down attention takes care of the rest and compute reward contingencies based on a broad range of prior experience. That's how we conceptualize the process. We wondered if the 7 or 2 repeat allele of DRD4 might have upgraded both of those 2 functions simultaneously, and thereby making the carriers learn the culturally most sanctioned behavioral patterns. What did we get? We carried out a principal component analysis, PCA, to identify a clear reward positivity component and P3A component, as you can see here. Both components were stronger on gain trials where there was a reward than on loss trials where there was no reward. But both of these effects were present only among those people who carried the 7 or 2 repeat variant of DRD4. This DRD4 by outcome interaction was evident for both Asians and European Americans. Now, given this, we may ask whether or not cultural variations in the volume of each of the 3 target regions of the brain, which I'm going to describe, might be more pronounced among carriers than among the non-carriers. As I mentioned above, there are 3 interesting empirical generalizations. 1, self is different. 2, social perception, perspective taking is different. And 3, cognition is different. For each of those 3 psychological differences, we might be able to, we are able to identify some a priori regions of interest which might show some interesting predictable effects. First of all, self. Independent self involves goal pursuit, value-based decision-making, and very abstract self-concept. All those functions are located somewhere in prefrontal cortex, particularly orbitofrontal cortex and medial prefrontal cortex is involved. And by using the logic underlining London cab driver study, juggling study, and so on, namely that more you use those regions, the region become bigger for some reason, then we might expect that those regions, OFC or MPFC, may become larger over time for East Asians than for European Americans. How about perspective taking? Well, obviously, there are many areas involved in perspective taking, but one particular area that's uniquely involved in perspective taking is temporal-parietal junction. And TPJ may be expected to be larger for East Asian than for European Americans. And finally, contextual processing, cognition, holistic processing involves contextual processing. And interestingly, early on in visual processing, different brain regions are dedicated to the processing of objects as opposed to scenes, sceneries, context. And in fact, there are a few regions identified for the processing of scenes. One region that is very prominent is called parahippocampal place area, PPA. And we might predict that this particular region could be larger in volume for East Asians than for European Americans. Now, as an effort to investigate these possibilities, we recently scanned about 130 subjects, about half of them Asian-born Americans, Asian-born Asians, and about half European Americans, North Americans of European heritage, and all as students at the University of Michigan. We scanned those subjects, and initially to get some sense of what might be going on, we carried out the whole brain analysis to identify which region might show a systematic volume differences. Here's the result. What you can see is that there are few very interesting findings. One interesting finding comes from here, MPFC and OFC. Here, volume difference is significantly greater for European Americans than for the East Asians after controlling for gender, age, and total brain volume. By the way, there's no total brain volume difference between those two subjects group. And this is a massive effect. This is a massive effect. Now, there are one more interesting difference, which comes here, TPJ on one side, on right-hand side. And here, Asians show a bigger volume, a greater volume in TPJ as opposed to European Americans. Now, context processing region is far in the inside, and we didn't find any difference in this very initial whole brain analysis that may be lacking some sensitivity. Now, next question is whether those cultural differences in brain volume might be systematically modulated by a gene, DRD4. So given the reasoning I gave to you, we might expect that the cultural difference you find here in these regions, and probably in PPA and some other scene processing region as well, might be more pronounced for people who are carrying 7 or 2 repeat allele of DRD4, which presumably predispose people to learn culture's reward contingencies more effectively. Here's what we got for OFC, orbitofrontal cortex. What you see is that European Americans are greater in volume in OFC as compared to Asians, but this difference was significantly more pronounced for 7 or 2 repeat allele carriers than for non-carriers. And the same pattern was evident for MPFC as well. How about TPJ? Here's a pattern we got. Here, volume difference is reversed. So the carriers show significantly greater volume if they are Asian-born Asians as compared to European Americans. But this difference was non-significantly reversed for non-carriers. How about context processing regions? As I mentioned to you, here the signal was much more subtle. So what we did was to identify some region of interest to see if there might be any area within that region that might show cultural differences. And we got some interesting difference. So for example, here PPA, well, there's a region within PPA that's greater in volume in one cultural group as opposed to the other. And in fact, the difference came out in predicted direction. East Asians show greater volume in PPA as opposed to European Americans. As I mentioned to you, there are a few other scene processing regions which have been identified. One is a medial place area. And here again, we show a similar cultural difference in the same direction. And finally, occipital place area, that's again, yet another scene processing region. And again, we found a very, very similar effect. So here, those signals are very, very subtle. And that might explain we didn't find any DRD4 by cultural interaction, and we didn't find any such evidence regardless. So, excuse me. So the next question is, those psychological differences, those brain differences are supposedly reflecting psychological differences in independence or interdependence. But is there any evidence? That is, will the brain differences lead to cultural variations in cognition, emotion, and motivation? And I can offer two sorts of evidence that the brain and psychological processes are linked. First, we assume that those three regions of the brain we focused on, that is prefrontal area, TPJ area, and C processing regions, particularly PPA, but two additional regions, are in the service of independence or interdependence. And therefore, we may expect that the cortical volume of these regions should be related systematically to independence or interdependence, or possibly both. So in order to investigate this, in all those studies, we measured self-construal independence or interdependence by using self-report questionnaire. So independent self-construal indicated by an affirmative response to a question like, I always try to have my own opinion, I'm comfortable with being singled out for praise or rewards and so on. And interdependent self-construal indicated by an agreement to a statement, such as, I'm concerned about what people think of me. I think it is important to keep good relations with, among one's acquaintances, and so on. So we examined if there might be any systematic relationship between the self-construals, independence, interdependence, and possibly both between those and brain volume. Here's what we got for OFC. Very early on, we addressed this problem, and first graph you see is that early data we published in 2017. Here, systematic difference in relationships such that greater OFC volume predict lower level of interdependent self-construal. So that is, there's an inverse relationship between those two. We replicated this relationship in in a subsequent study where we also examined DRD4 effect, for which I reported just a moment ago. Here, there's a fairly clear systematic inverse relationship again between OFC volume and interdependence in both Asian Americans and, Asian-born Asians and European Americans. And we found a similar relationship between interdependence and MPFC volume as well in this study. Actually, these findings is consistent with other finding from China, which was just being reported just around the same time in a different journal. Here, Wang and his colleagues demonstrated that there's a positive relationship between MPFC volume and independence. And here, interestingly, we found signals for interdependence scale. And here, those researchers found signals between the difference between independence and interdependence. And well, at this very moment, we just don't know when independence has an effect, when interdependence might have a mirrored effect. And I think this inconsistency might reflect the fact that sometimes independence can be achieved by suppressing interdependence, and you can be interdependent by suppressing your independence and vice versa. So, but some other times not. And exactly when one or the other scales might work, we don't know. But one empirical generalization is that when correlations happen, we find correlation in expected direction, except which scale or which measure, independence, interdependence, or difference between those two might have that effect. We just don't know at this point. Now, how about TPJ? Here's our recent finding. Here, greater TPJ volume predict lower level of independence. So again, it's very curious why TPJ didn't predict interdependence, but here it negatively predicted independence. So conceptually congruous, except question remains why one measure of self-construal works better in some cases, but something else seemed to work better in other cases. Here, scene processing region. Here, we got signal for the difference measure, independence minus interdependence. So more interdependent people show greater volume in PPA. By the way, we didn't find any difference, any effects like this correlations for the remaining two scene processing regions. And I'm happy to elaborate on our reasoning, which is just speculation, but at least this finding is pretty consistent with what, my reasoning today. Now, other interesting finding, other interesting support for the possibility that the brain difference may have correspondence in some way to psychological measures came from one very early study we conducted to see if there might be DRD4 by culture interaction on self-construal or some other related individual difference measures. So here we tested nearly 400 subjects, half European Americans, half Asian-born Asians, and they are consisting of both carriers and non-carriers of DRD4, 7 or 2 repeat allele. And we administered several 4 scales, which are supposedly tapping on independence. Independent self-construal, self-esteem, self-efficacy, value of self-expression. And we included 2 scales which are supposedly tapping interdependence. One, interdependent self-construal. Two, holistic cognitive style. We carried out factor analysis to show that those four scales pertaining to independence coheres to form a single scale. Two scales pertaining to interdependence coheres to form the interdependence scale. So what I'm going to show to you is a different score between independence factor and interdependence factor. As you can see, there's a DRD4 by culture interaction. And as you can see, European Americans are more independent as opposed to interdependent. And Asian-born Asians are more interdependent as opposed to independent. However, interestingly, but consistent with the brain data, this cultural difference was significantly greater. And in fact, that existed only among carriers of a 7 or 2 repeat allele of DRD4. And of course, this is consistent with the neuroscience evidence I presented earlier in my talk today. So what can we conclude from the series of studies I presented today? First of all, these studies show that cultural experience seem to sink in to the brain through reinforcement-mediated learning processes. What this means is that the brain contains an archaeological record, so to speak, of cultural experiences. And this record exists for all experiences. Many of them may have gone with the wind and with the ages, but many of them may still stay, even though they are no longer available for conscious recollection or recognition. Another important point is that DRD4 may have co-evolved with culture on Eurasian continent over the last 50 or maybe 75,000 years. As for future directions, first and foremost, it is important to look into other structural features of the brain, including various network parameters. Second, we have yet to show that the volume differences in the brain might be linked to behavioral outcomes. I showed the initial evidence by using questionnaire measure, but right now evidence is lacking, which is linking brain differences to performance measures, some of which I described early on in my talk. Third, there's a very thorny issue of the timing of the acquisition of culture. We suspect that there are sensitive periods in which brain plasticity is maximal, but this needs to be investigated. Lastly, the role of DRD4 is likely to be limited to Eurasian continent. So similar effort, I think, is well justified, among others, on African continent. So thank you very much for everybody. Those are some of the members of my lab. I miss those days when we could have a wonderful time like this. I also want to thank, among others, Chin-Kyung Yu, who conducted all the brain volume analysis. James Glazer, he conducted this ERP study of reward processing. And Christina Salvador, who was involved in many of those studies, particularly theoretical formulation early on. And finally, I'm grateful to support from those institutions. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shinobu, for this very rich and provocative set of findings and sort of evidence of coevolutionary processes and sort of evolution for cultural learning itself. So I want to thank you again for really a tremendously stimulating and helpful presentation.
Thank you very much. It was great. Yeah, thank you so much. See you next week.
Have a good evening.
Good evening.
Take care, Shinobu. Thanks again.
Thank you.